When did you first decide to make architecture your life work?
Well, fortunately, I never had to decide. It was decided for me before I was born. My mother was a teacher, and she wanted an architect for a son. I happened to be the son, and of course, naturally, an architect. I was conditioned by her. The room into which I was born was hung with the wood engravings of the English cathedrals made by Timothy Cole. Do you remember those? So I was born into architecture.
What was your first job as an architect, Mr. Wright?
Well, I think I wanted to be an architect, and as near as I could get to it. In Madison, we were poor. We had no money to send me to an architectural school, and Madison, our home, had an engineering school, and a very kind dean, Professor Conover, gave me a stipend to work for him, work my way through the course at the university, and I worked my way almost through it. If I'd stayed 3 months longer, I would have been given a degree as an engineer, but I was anxious to be an architect, and so I started out for Chicago 3 months before I would have graduated. And I suppose you could say that my work for Conover, perhaps, as an engineer, designing clips and little details of ironwork, was my first architectural job.
Would you say that any of Sullivan's ideas in architecture influenced you at that time?
Naturally. They were influencing nearly everybody in the country.
How so?
He was the real radical of his day, and his thought gave us the skyscraper. You see, the building was, when buildings first began to be tall, they didn't know how to make them tall. They would put one 2-story or 3-story building on top of another until they had enough. And I remember Liebermeister would come in and did come in and throw something on my table, the Wainwright building in St. Louis. He said, "Wright, the thing is tall. What's the matter with a tall building?" And there it was, tall. And after that, why, the skyscraper began to flourish. And I think all the skyscrapers you see today were the result of Louis Sullivan's initiative. And that was his kind of mind, his type of thought. You see, he saw the thing directly for what it was.
Most people who are at all acquainted with your work know the fact that your work is organic and intimately bound up with the lives of people. When did this idea first begin to take shape in your work?
Well, that's pretty difficult to say. Of course, in my youth, nothing existed of the sort that I wanted to see happen. It didn't exist anywhere. It had to be made, and it happened out here on the western prairies of Chicago.
There are times when it can seem like folly to keep fixing a house that in many ways has proved stubbornly unfixable.
And I've thought a lot about the system because it was experimental, but then on the other hand, there's no doubt that it was flawed. At the very beginning, I believed that the textile block system should be held sacrosanct. But if you go to Japan, you see, if you follow out the idea of building a building in concert with nature means that it has a life. And when you carry forward with a life, at some time, the life ends. In some ways, I know this would be horrific to an American mentality, but perhaps they should just have been allowed to deteriorate. And that would have been the logical conclusion of the system.
We always joked that we would, if we got really rich and famous, we would go back there and paint it gold and then burn it down.
Yeah, you can't burn concrete though. So
I know, that's why it's a funny...
It's a joke.
It's a joke, because you can't. We could melt it.
Yeah.
Some historians have stressed the differences between this house and the concrete block designs that preceded it, even seeing in its corner window the seeds of the case study modern houses of post-war Los Angeles. But more striking is how similar the concrete block houses are as a group, how consistently dense and introverted. The Freeman house, as seen from the street, is just as windowless, secretive, and off-putting just as suggestive of a crypt as the Millard House, the first of Wright's concrete experiments here.
By the end of 1923, he was feeling that there wasn't going to be a big future for him. And he sort of was at a dead end. And he didn't feel comfortable here. He felt alienated from the real estate market of Los Angeles.
California history is filled with people who come out to California imagining a future for themselves that never takes place. They never discover gold. They never get famous. They never star in a film. They never find oil. So they go home.
He was not well received in Southern California. People were not people willing to take the risk or be experimental enough to build with these concrete blocks. And I think many people simply didn't like the houses. They are not domestic in any conventional sense.
He was somebody who was impulsive, and he would change. He was perceptive. And so if it looked like it wasn't going where it wanted to go, that's it. He went back home.
After leaving Los Angeles at the end of 1923, Wright maintained some connections here. His son Lloyd stayed on in LA and even continued the family tradition of designing houses covered in pre-Columbian ornament. Visiting this house by Lloyd Wright is telling, though. What Lloyd produced has none of the gravity, the power of his father's LA houses. It feels like a stage set, some corner of Disneyland. The house is a pastiche in a way Frank Lloyd Wright's LA houses are not. Across LA, as the 1920s wore on, pre-Columbian architecture became all the rage, though with more flamboyance and populism than had marked Wright's use of it. Most notably, a British architect named Robert Stacey Judd came here, fully embraced pre-Columbian culture, and never looked back. He built the Aztec Hotel in Monrovia. Here he is doing a made-up pre-Columbian dance in made-up pre-Columbian costume. And here's a dancer performing some of that same choreography in front of the Ennis House in the late 1920s. Later on, Frank Lloyd Wright would come back to design the 1939 Sturgis House in Brentwood, a cantilevered version of Wright's small Usonian houses. In the 1950s, he designed this small shopping center on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. But none of those later designs have the peculiar force or density of the LA houses of the 1920s. Now nearly a century old, these concrete block houses retain their wildly anomalous character. They stand apart from Wright's work and apart from the rest of the Los Angeles architecture of the period.
The LA houses are muscular, they're brutal, they're romantic, they're fantastic, you know, they're strange.
And all these years later, they've settled into an odd place in the culture, popping up not just in the movies, but in the digital world. It turns out Wright's blocks work exceptionally well in the game Minecraft, which relies on a similar modular logic. There's also a composite version of the block houses in a video game starring Buffy the Vampire Slayer, in which Buffy fights off undead opponents in a series of appropriately dark and moody Wrightian spaces. To get a final and more personal perspective on Wright's time in LA, I drove out to Malibu one morning to meet Eric Lloyd Wright, Frank's grandson and Lloyd's son, and an architect in his own right who's worked on restoring several of his grandfather's houses. Eric Wright lives with his wife, Mary, in a compound overlooking the Pacific that feels very much like the end of the road. If Frank Lloyd Wright sought in LA that far corner of the US, his grandson, now 88, seems to have found that far corner of Los Angeles itself. We met in an unfinished building made, appropriately enough, out of concrete on the edge of his property. We talked about the textile block system, his relationship with his grandfather, and about his work on some of the LA houses. I asked him why he thought Wright had come here after Maima's murder. What had drawn him to Los Angeles?
Well, he, of course, had been very upset about the death of his companion and all the adverse publicity that had come about because of his living with her and being together. So he thought that Los Angeles, this was a new town coming up. He could have a new life.
And then, for me, a key question. When Frank Lloyd Wright began working in Los Angeles, what was his state of mind?
Well, it was one of, I think, sorrow, because they had had a wonderful life. He had had with Mamie Bothwick a wonderful life until her death.
That brings us back to my overnight stay at the Millard House and the question I posed at the start. Why do the LA houses look the way they do? Are they expressions not just of a desire for privacy and escape, but expressions, to use Eric Wright's word, of sorrow? Some of the people I interviewed took issue with that idea.
Many people have looked at the California houses, particularly the concrete block houses of 1923, as things that almost seem like mausoleums, or they're heavy, and that this reflects an idea of grief. Now, can't get into Wright's head. I don't know that I quite buy that.
After a while, it was impossible not to notice a split. Historians have tended to play down the pre-Columbian aspects of the houses, and especially their connections to death, and to play up their wide range of other influences. Artists, filmmakers, Hollywood location scouts, and video game designers, on the other hand, have all had a simpler and perhaps more instinctive take. They've seen what's right in front of them, right in front of all of us, that these houses are shadowed by violence and even death. Over time, I came to agree with this more direct view, even to think of the houses as a precursor to LA noir. And for me, it hardly felt like a leap. If my experience as a critic has taught me anything, it's that if you spend enough time in a building and listen closely enough to what it's saying, it will tell you pretty much everything you need to know. And you'd have to be putting your fingers in your ears not to hear how clearly Wright's Los Angeles houses are communicating their more funereal aspects. What's more, the vocabulary that has grown up around the houses, some of it from Wright himself, is consistently dark and even macabre. Drama of Sophocles, brutal, sinister, tragedy, lacking joy. Part of what's happening here, I think, is that scholars are understandably reluctant to embrace the crude caricature of pre-Columbian culture and its various death cults, especially that of the Aztecs, that was an important part of the way Americans understood those ruins during Wright's day. Yet there's no doubt that those caricatures shaped Wright's understanding of pre-Columbian designs and their meaning. And it's not as though Wright was one to discourage a psychological reading of his architecture. To the contrary, as the critic Herbert Muschamp once pointed out, Wright explicitly offered up his life along with his work for critical appraisal, insisting that neither could be adequately understood without the other.
His architecture saves him, in a sense. It becomes, it's this mission, this project that helps him to recover from that, just catastrophic personal tragedy.
In the end, I came down on the side of the idea that Wright's LA houses, these strange apparitions, are not just heavy, but heavy-hearted. There was something in pre-Columbian architecture, its starkness, its state of ruin, that suggested to Wright a sensibility that might suit Southern California and his own uncertain frame of mind in the years following the murders. I don't think it's the case that the houses look off-putting and crypt-like to us because they're empty, because none of them is now used as a full-time residence. I think the opposite is true. I think none of them is now used as a full-time residence precisely because they're off-putting and crypt-like. Because they were a means for Wright of finally putting a troubled period behind him for good. Mamie Borthwick is buried in the little graveyard I visited next to Unity Chapel in Spring Green. She's also buried in Los Angeles.